All right, this week on the Front End Podcast, we're going to be talking about Tailwind and component libraries. And this week I've got Chris with me who actually wrote this article. So Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Cool. Yeah, so one of the things that has come up recently in my web development career has been how the heck do you actually build a component library? And actually, one of the issues that we've been facing is finding some consistent, lightweight way to make a nice component library. And Zach, I know you've helped me find a couple of the tools that we're actually going to be using in here, and it actually turns out pretty sweet. With that, I'll jump right in, share my screen. We can go through the blog post that I wrote and go from there. Some of the tools that we're using, I'll just jump right into those, but we're going to be using TSDX, which is an awesome library that helps you start your own libraries, really. It's great for component libraries built up because it has a React template, it has one with Storybook, or you can use it for really whatever else. I know I mentioned some of this in the article, but it does export CommonJS. Yes, it's got tree shaking built in. It uses rollup under the hood. And it's just a great way to jumpstart any project that you might want to get started on, or any library that you want to get started on, really. It's got full support for Jest and ESLint and Prettier, TypeScript, all of that great stuff. The other thing that we're going to be using is Tailwind. Yeah, Tailwind, I have been skeptical about it for a while, but after using it, it's actually a lot nicer. One of the things that I've noticed that we do end up running into in our web development careers is when we're styling stuff, there's a million ways to style things. CSS modules, styled components, all kinds of different style libraries. One of the things I notice happening frequently is the fact that a lot of styles get duplicated and you end up with a much bigger CSS file or style sheet in your page than you really want to. The nice thing about Tailwind is all the styles are fairly consistent across all the classes. You can add your own if you need something to not be consistent. Comes with full support for theming. But yeah, I see a lot of people online try and argue against why Tailwind is such a bad thing, but really in the end, it's minimal duplication of what styles are going to be on your page. So I know you definitely turned me on to trying to use Tailwind, Zach, and I definitely am enjoying it a lot more now.
Yeah, I was going to say my favorite thing about it is just that your CSS never really grows. It's not going to be that
Right.
often that you're adding new Tailwind classes, and even then you're probably using most of the same ones you've already used, so it just never grows.
Yeah. Yeah, very lightweight. You end up with minimal CSS. The other library, it actually comes from the builders Tailwind CSS. They built a library called HeadlessUI and right now has support for React and Vue. This was mainly an addition. Like technically you don't have to use this if you don't want to in your component library. This was just a nice addition because it really does help with getting started on some of those complicated components and making your dependency or using less dependencies. As far as I wanted to install Material UI, then I have more dependencies on having that entire UI library built into this. If I wanted to try and figure out how to build a transition component, I can either install React Transition Group or some other transition library that's out there. But this comes with an unopinionated transition component. So it's really nice because you can style it however you want, and it's legitimately unstyled. There's no CSS in this, which is really cool. So you can truly make it your own. I know the website, if you end up taking a look at it, it does have a lot of like nice styled components. That's just because they're using Tailwind classes. And the other thing too is it works perfectly with Tailwind.
So I was going to ask you, have you gotten to use any of those components yet? I'm guessing Dropdown, but I haven't really gotten to play with HeadlessUI as much as you probably have already.
Yeah, the transition component's really nice. It makes actually reading what a transition does super easy, and it works with Tailwind classes. I've used the dialog or the modal component. That one is a little bit different. I definitely have used Material UI. Even where I work now, I'm using Material UI. But using the modal component was a little bit of a shift just because kind of got to understand that you're the one styling everything. Like they'll put the DOM elements in there for you, but really like the overlay, for example, you have to fix position it and whatnot. So it's a little bit more work as far as styling goes, but functionality wise, it's all built in. So it handles open states and closed states and backdrop clicks. The other nice thing too about the library is that it's accessible. So instead of trying to build these like modal components or these drop-down components with keyboard functionality, like if I press escape, what's going to happen when you're on the drop-down menu? If you build it yourself, you have to like actually build out all that functionality, whereas this is just built in. It makes it really nice. And they are adding more and more components, which is cool. If you look at their ideas list on GitHub, there's actually a good amount of requests and ideas that people are putting out there.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy how fast they've been going through and adding things. Between that and I follow along with Tailwind UI since I paid for it, they just put out new components so frequently. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's cool. Definitely a well-supported library. It's actually really interesting if you go and look at like their build process. I think you sent me the blog on this, but if you look at their build process and how they figured out how to do this very generic library that wasn't platform agnostic, or that's platform agnostic, meaning they can code all of this once and they have their own custom compiler that actually builds out the React components and builds out the Vue components. I imagine they'll keep going and get something else, get another library in there, but it's really interesting the way they built it.
Yeah, my guess is Svelte will be next.
Yeah, that's getting a lot of popularity lately. Cool. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. One of the first things that we do is obviously we're using the TSDX library to create the initial library. And really what that's going to give you is it'll give you a test folder, a stories folder, a source folder, example. It sets up Storybook for you when you're using the actual story template. But yeah, it's really quick. You don't have to do anything. There's a config file that you can add in here if you want to make your own custom roll-up styles and everything like that, because that is the bundler that it uses under the hood. But yeah, I do go through some of this stuff and what's all generated. I think one of the coolest parts of this library, especially if you're doing like React with Storybook, is it has that little playground. And it even does it without the React template, but it has that examples folder, which is legitimately a playground where you can install your library, and it's like a React app within your package, which is really cool. So you don't have to publish right away in order to see if your libraries actually work.
Yeah, and that's smart. There's a couple of times I published something where I like got the import path wrong or something, and being able to check that beforehand is really nice.
Yeah, definitely. And just to see that your imports are working, are your styles being built, are your types being output and everything like that. It's definitely a really easy way to make sure that all your stuff is doing what it's supposed to without actually publishing. So yeah, one of the things also that I'll mention too is once we get to installing Tailwind, I see a lot of people using the PostCSS 7 configuration or the compatibility, the PostCSS 7 compatibility build via Tailwind. And that's just really it's the same Tailwind. They explain it on the Tailwind website that it's the exact same library. It's just using PostCSS 7 under the hood for other libraries that are using PostCSS 7. So an example would be like Storybook. I don't think that they've upgraded their PostCSS, but they do have a plugin that can be used that can use PostCSS 8, which is really cool. And that's what we do here. So we get the latest of Tailwind, PostCSS, and Auto Prefixer, which is nice. The PostCSS config, this is the default Tailwind setup. There's not really much to go over there, but if you do want to add more PostCSS configuration, you can do it in here. And then really Tailwind initialization, this comes straight from their docs. It's pretty straightforward. So one of the things that I do end up using in this is the Tailwind's JIT mode, the just-in-time mode, which is really nice because especially with the hot module reloading, building in Storybook, we want to make sure that all those styles are actually getting loaded into our stories once we're building. So when we do that just in time, really what it does is it takes a look at all your CSS or all your files that use the CSS classes, and it only takes those and injects them where they're supposed to be. So makes the build really light, makes building components really light and quick too. So it's a great way to do that. The purge, that's just so we can specify where we're actually getting our CSS from. So if you have a different folder structure or you want to make this your own, you just have to update these purge paths to point where you're actually using your CSS. And one thing I'll say about this, and I do mention it later, is if you use this library, your component library that you build, in another project that also uses Tailwind, you don't have to include the output CSS of your library. You can just include the purge path or the path of your node module, your component library, and Tailwind will go through the component library that you're using and actually get those classes.
So Chris, and
So it's kinda
speaking
nice.
of that, I actually wrote a blog post that'll be coming out after yours about how I was able to support like people who use Tailwind versus those who don't, and having the build output for them not conflict with their global styles and anything like that. So that'll be going into
nice.
that more in depth.
Oh, sweet. Perfect. Cool. So next thing, again, more basic default Tailwind setup. This comes straight from their docs as well. And then since we're building in Storybook, the methodology or the idea behind the way I built the component library is that we're going to build in Storybook. We don't want to, make this little test page or whatever and import our components on there. We want to build our components in Storybook. That's the only place that we'll need to use them other than the playground if we want to actually test it out. And that makes it really great for building components, because one thing that I've noticed, especially in my web development career, is building things in isolation really helps you focus. It really helps you understand what it is you're doing, and it helps you make sure that you're not actually running into some sort of conflict or error due to another component or the page that you're on, or because of a network request that's failing or or any of that stuff. We build in isolation. We can build our components with what it is we're trying to do. If I'm going to build a drop-down menu, I want to build it all by itself and say, these are the props that it's going to get, and that's it. I don't want to have to worry about any other data, any other wrapping components or anything like that. And that way, it helps you understand the behavior of your component too as you're building it out. So just a note on that. I really enjoy building in Storybook, and it saves me a lot of time too. This right here, this is going to be our Tailwind CSS file that we just created up here. That is what we're putting this into the Storybook preview.js, and this is all Storybook needs to actually import these styles and use them in Book. So one thing here, this is where Storybook needs to use the PostCSS plugin. Technically it works, but it's using the implicit PostCSS loader, which is going to be deprecated. One of the nice things to do that Book has is their PostCSS add-on plugin, and this configuration comes straight from the documentation for that page. This is just, so we're using PostCSS 8 right here, in case anybody's confused by that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Storybook used to automatically include it if you needed it, but now you have to be explicit and add it, like Chris has.
Yeah, thank you for that. Once we actually get to this point, we can actually start building components. And I will say something about the whole methodology again that I just thought of is one of the ideas behind building this component library was that we want to make sure that we have as few dependencies as possible. I know one thing that I've noticed, especially working on applications that are jobs that use multiple applications or have multiple sites, if you will, that use the same component library. One of the things that you end up running into is, say if you are using like Material UI and then your parent application, you're also using Material UI. If those versions don't match up, you are going to run into some serious issues. And then you have to manage updating dependencies for both applications in your component library. And then it just becomes a hot mess where you're trying to keep all these dependencies up to date, and it's really not fun. So the idea behind using only Tailwind and Headless UI was that we have minimal dependencies in our library. And I think that's it also makes the component library easier to understand and easier to use too, because we don't have to look at what packages we're using. Obviously, you can install things like Lodash or any styled components, whatnot. But even then, even using styled components, I've run into conflicts where the dependencies or the versions of styled components don't match up. And that's definitely something that's a huge pain when you're trying to make something very generic and reusable across multiple applications, like we are here with this component library.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't see those same issues happening with Tailwind. I think I even sent it to you. Someone had tweeted like they hadn't touched their project since 2017 when Tailwind was in beta, and they updated it in like a minute, because the only thing that's really changed is they've added more stuff, and the config has like minor changes and additions. So it's really nice looking forward.
Yeah, and the cool thing is like you don't even need Tailwind in your parent application. Really, all this is just outputting CSS, and there's no dependencies there. Your component library uses those classes, and then You import that CSS in your application that's using your component library, and you're done. There's no other dependencies. And I will say, like, we are using Headless UI. That's its own package, but it is specifically built for building components, which in this case is nice because that's all we're doing. So we don't need to use Headless UI in our parent application. If there's a component that you need, it goes in your component library. So
True.
I know there's always edge cases, but yeah, it's definitely one of those things where minimal dependencies is a nice way to go, especially when you're using something that's shared.
Yeah, and to summarize a little bit, one of the problems we had is that we had a UI library that had Storybook, Storybook, but style components and material UI. But then our main application also had style components and material UI, and those versions get out of sync because maybe we haven't had time to work on the UI library, but the main app needs the new version and has to build a component just for that app that doesn't go in the shared library. And so with Tailwind, we hope to avoid all of those version problems.
At this point, these are the styles. These are the Tailwind styles that we're using in Storybook, which is cool. It's all working. We get styles loading. If you run a build at this point too, you'll notice that our classes that we use here are the only things included in the CSS. Now there are other classes that are like base classes that Tailwind includes. That's almost like a reset CSS in a way. It's very minimal stuff. It's just to make sure that your actual window has no margin or padding or anything like that, like a reset CSS. But here, with the just-in-time mode and with the purge path, we'll be able to see these update in real time. If we're updating these classes, our actual story will update and show the correct styles, which is really cool. And then another thing too, if you guys haven't done it yet, I highly recommend the IntelliSense, the Tailwind IntelliSense library or plugin for VS Code, if that's what you're using. I'm actually not sure if this plugin is ported to other editors like Sublime and stuff like that. I'm not sure if it's Zach, but
I'm not sure, but
uses VS Code.
I was gonna say I saw in the Stack Overflow survey it's like up to 70 or 60% or something like that. Hopefully, I'm not misquoting it. So I feel like everyone's using it. It's in web development.
Cool. But yeah, this is a really nice plugin, especially if you're new to Tailwind. I know some people on our team have been apprehensive, but just because there's so many classes, and there's no way that you're going to memorize everything that you have or everything that Tailwind has. So this library is really cool because you just start typing in the actual class name field, and you'll start seeing actual properties come up, and they give you a nice little translation of what those actually output in CSS and what, like if they're colors, they'll show you like a little color swatch on the side here. If it's margin or padding, it'll give you the actual translation from rem to pixels, which is really cool. It's super useful.
So that's super helpful, but also I hope I don't put you on the spot, but could you pull up the Tailwind docs? I want to just show that when you're coming from regular CSS, you can search for just any CSS property and we'll jump you right into the Tailwind class. Like right there, you could do the quick search and type like text align.
Yes.
And it will pull it up immediately for you. So it's very easy between the IntelliSense plugin and just searching the docs to instantly find the class you're looking for. And after a couple times of doing that, you already start getting it in your head. It becomes really fast.
Yeah, and the other thing too is it's all really repetitive. You know what I mean? Like we start building these apps and these components and whatnot, and we have an idea of what kind of classes we're going to use. And there's really like edge case classes that you might find you need, but for the most part, especially with like Flexbox and grid stuff, padding margin, all that stuff you start getting used to, and you just can start typing it out and using that IntelliSense autocomplete even if you're not sure the exact numbers. But yeah, I come to this website all the time and just do a Command K and start searching for stuff. So super useful. At this part, this is where we're going to install the Headless UI. Really from here, if you don't decide to use Headless UI, it's up to you, but this is a great way to get started with, like I said, some of those more complicated components like dialogues and drop downs and select menus. So especially transitions using Tailwind and the transition component is absolutely phenomenal. I love it. It's easier to use in React Transition Group, which I will say it took me a minute to get used to that library, but it's a lot easier than that. But in this example, I am just using their toggle switch, super basic. This is mostly from the actual documentation of Headless. I made a couple adjustments because they had some colors in there that were part of their custom theme for Tailwind that they were using. But otherwise, it's pretty much identical. Next thing is creating the story. Again, we're building in Storybook. Usually, I will say it's probably easier to do the story first, like maybe build out a stub component, then build out the story. And then as you add stuff, then you can add argument types from Storybook here, and you can add different props and default props and whatnot that you're going to be giving your component. But really, instead of trying to build out your entire component right away, I would say build out a stub component, put it in a story, and then open up Storybook so that you can actually start building and seeing these things live update. That would be my preferred way of actually building these things out.
That's good advice.
Thank you. The last thing that we have to do, really, and that's pretty much it. At this point, you'll see your story in here. How you build out your story, there's a ton of ways to configure your stories. Some people use like MDX. Some people like to just build out the component. I recommend looking at Storybook if you're not familiar with it and just going through their docs to understand how stories work and how to add argument types and these little controls over here. Once that's done, the last thing that we have to do is just a little bit of build configuration. Right now, if we actually look at the package.json, you'll have some of these scripts right here that are specifically from TSDX. So you'll have TSDX watch, which will start, or if you run npm start or yarn start, you'll actually have TSDX run the watch, so it'll build your library and watch for changes and rebuild. Building, this is the actual build process where it outputs our dist folder. And one of the things about this is that we do need to make sure that Tailwind is building for production, and that's where this line comes in. So this comes from the Tailwind documentation. We're basically just telling it that it's a production environment. We're going to run Tailwind CSS through the builder and then also minify it. So that way, once our CSS comes out, it looks like this, and it's really small. So that's what this line is for. And really, all you need to do is you're going to be adding this to the build script. So when you publish your package, we'll run npm or we'll run yarn prepare when you publish a package, but that'll run the build script, which is this. And then TSDX, every single time it builds, it overwrites this dist folder. So that's why we have to build our component library first, and then we build the Tailwind. So that's a really important order of operations there that I might have not mentioned. But really, that's about it. Once that's done, we can actually get it up on GitHub. So if you're used to creating repositories and uploading projects, then away you go. But for those who don't know, really just go onto your GitHub account. If you don't have one, make one, and then you're going to hit the new repository. Once you do that, you'll go through, give it a name. You can leave all the default values. It's up to you how you want to configure your repository, but really we just need the destination URL or the origin URL. So that way we can actually initialize, and that's what this code is here. We'll initialize a Git repo. We will push it up, and then once that's done, we can actually go on to publishing it. We need to get it up in Git repository just because npm does require it. You can't just push up a random folder and publish it to npm. So
I'm pretty sure you can just npm publish without a Git repo. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can.
I was looking at their docs and I thought that they said that you need an actual repository to link it to.
I guess we'll have to look into that.
Oh man.
Maybe that was, I think that was, they do ask for the Git repo, you're right, when you publish or when you set up your package. But I think you can lie and just put a random Git repo URL.
Oh, interesting. See, I didn't know that. Cool. So yeah, like I said, when you publish a package, it will run the prepare script. That's where we needed to change it to actually run our build script, which includes the TSDX build and the Tailwind. And then if you're not logged into npm already, you do need an npm account so you can publish that. So if you don't have one, I actually linked here to create a new account. There's steps there that you can use. And really, if you're not logged in, same basic thing, npm login, and it'll actually get you logged in, asking for your credentials. And once that's done, you can publish it. Unless you pay for private repos, you add this little access public flag here. I'm not sure if there's another way to publish, or if we even need that. Do you know if we need that flag?
I'm pretty sure, at least with npm, you do the very first time, because for some reason the default is publishing private. So the first time you publish, I think you do need that. Could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure.
Cool. either way, at this point, you should see your package being published, and then you can go to your NPM account and actually check it out. If you don't know where your NPM account is, you can actually just go to the NPM.js website and search for your library, and it'll be up there, which is kind of cool. So this last part, or one of the last parts, is actually using that example playground. If we go into our folder here, there is one thing I will note. The version of Parcel that they're using doesn't, for some reason, it causes an error when it builds. Just found that installing a latest version of Parcel will actually fix that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Parcel is the little dev server that TSDX uses for the example project. And I know for some reason it's been like 6 months or more that they've had an old Parcel version. It doesn't work unless you use the version he has specified here.
After you do that, you can actually install your component library, which is whatever you named it. This one was Awesome Component Library. This is pretty awesome. And then once you're done with that, the two things that you need to do. So when we build, we output our actual tailwind.css file. So that was the production build that we were talking about. And you do have to import that CSS into your application. You'll import it at the top level of whatever app you're using. In this case, it's just the index.tsx from the example folder. All your components will have all the classes, but we actually need to import that CSS file that we built.
We'll talk about it more in an upcoming podcast when I go more into like building for your library. But as you mentioned earlier, if you happen to be using Tailwind at the app level, you don't have to import the built CSS. You just need to add it to your purge list at your app level.
And I do have an example of that down below, so I will show that as one of the last things. But really, same concept. Once you're in the example folder, you can run yarn start, and it actually launches the little dev server from Parcel on the port 1234. And then you got it in there. So you can import whatever components in here that you want. You can start a new project with Tailwind and without Tailwind. We actually did that as an example to show that if you want to use Tailwind in your application with Tailwind as the dependency there or without it, we built two projects and tried it both ways, and it works great. The other thing too is that it also exports all the types when you build. So if you're using TypeScript, that's great. It'll show you all your types right. The other thing too is this exports in just raw JavaScript. So you don't have to use TypeScript with your library. You can build it in TypeScript, or you can use it in a TypeScript project, or you can just use it in a regular old JS project. Definitely is nice that it exports all the types. So when we're using that in our example application, we actually automatically see just by hovering over the toggle switch what the component props are and what it returns and all that stuff. So it's really nice. And then the other thing too, and I did mention this above, but it exports the common.js and the ESM. If you want to import it like regular, just doing like an import statement like you would typically do, or you can use it by using require, which is also kind of nice. So you get that flexibility of using this component library in different projects.
Yeah, and one thing to mention, Jest still forces you to use CommonJS, so it's nice that TSDX just takes care of still exporting CommonJS. And so this is kind of the power of TSDX. Yeah. It puts it in all the correct formats. You don't have to set up rollup. You don't have to set up TypeScript to build the types and to put them in the right spot and add a line to your package JSON. It's just all taken care of.
Yeah, it's insanely fast how if I had to go back and do this all over again, I could get a component library or some other library started in probably less than 30 minutes. It's insanely quick how fast you can get up and running. And then this right here, this is the example that I was telling you about. If this, say you have your new project, this is your tailwind.config.js or TS or whatever you have it in your new project as. But this would be the purge path that you would add. You would just add the node modules, your component library, and then the DSM work, and just select all the JavaScript files. And then that way, when Tailwind runs in your new project, it'll actually look at your component library folder and go through all those files and pick out all the classes that need to be included. So the last part here, and this is actually a good suggestion on your part, Zach, is just showing the component building process. How do you even get started? Like after you're done with this, what do you do next? Like I was saying earlier, typically I like to just build a nice little stub component. We'll get the story built, but really this is just an example, like a walkthrough of what you would do if you're going to start adding more and more components. So just a basic button. If you want, you can change the folder structure, but I just have all the components at the source level, and then you export it from the index.tsx. And then once you're done with that, you create a story, run Storybook, and then just start building. Use classes, add props, whatever you need to do. But that's really like the component building process. Start your stub, export it, create a story, start up Storybook, and then start adding classes and functionality. And then, yeah, see, this is what I started with. I started with just a super basic button. I copied some of the classes that Tailwind actually has an example on their website. And after that, I just started adding props to where you can customize it, adding classes, and then adding controls in here so you can actually disable and enable it, and then adding titles so you can modify the text in Storybook. But these archetypes, if like I said, if you guys want, definitely read up more on building stories because there's a lot of functionality in Storybook. You don't have to put everything on your component or in the actual story that you're building here. It's pretty straightforward if you get all this stuff. Yeah, and then that's it functioning. That's working really well. And again, this is, if you want to change the way that this is done, there's all kinds of different ways to do this. You can install other dependencies if you really have to. If you want to use styled components, you can use styled components, but it's up to you. Really, the nice thing about using Tailwind and Headless UI is you have as few dependencies as possible with a lot of functionality right off the bat. So yeah, I think that's about it. Did you have any questions or want to make any comments?
No, I just want to say I love how you broke this down. I know new developers especially, like you hear component library all the time and you're wondering like, how do you even do that? And it seems like this crazy complicated thing. And I think you broke it down and made one in one of the simplest but most powerful ways possible. There's just one or two dependencies and you can do anything and it's very powerful. So yeah, I just love how you broke it all down.
Cool. Glad you like it. And I really hope it's simple enough for newer developers to understand because it's, yeah, like you said, as a new developer, even thinking about doing something like this was a daunting task for me. Yeah, once it's done and you actually understand what's happening and how it works, it's a lot easier and a lot easier to wrap your head around.
Cool. Thanks for being on, and hopefully you can come back when I talk about my like third-party component library building with Tailwind blog posts, because I think you'd be the perfect person to go over that with.
Cool. Yeah, I love it. I'd love to.
Sweet.